Well, I'd like to begin by obviously thanking the Royal Society for the opportunity to speak today, and it's a great pleasure for us, of course, because we're a relatively new project. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? It's a relatively new project, and we're anxious to get some publicity. This is our homepage. We're up live. You can visit us anytime. This is a project based at the Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine at University College. This is the centre's homepage. And what we aim to do is publish online transcriptions and high-quality images of Livingstone's medical and scientific letters. Current work is based on a 3-year grant from the Wellcome Trust. I might briefly tell you about the team. That's me, Chris Lawrence. I'm Professor Emeritus, which simply means they don't pay me. Janet Brown at Harvard, who worked on the Darwin letters, is Assistant Director. Professor Anne Hardy is a grant holder, which means she wraps us over the knuckles if we spend too much money. Caroline Overy and Sharon Messenger, seen here at Blantyre, the Livingstone Centre, under the magnificent statue of Livingstone being savaged by a lion, are called research assistants, but that really is not do justice to the work that they do. They do most of the paleographical work. They transcribe the letters and code them for posting on the net. Mike Hawkins, who will speak later, is our technical wizard, but Mike, of course, is an historian of science in his own right, a historian of Thomas Willis. And Gary Lee works with us occasionally as photographer and on scanning, and is also a technical genius. I might say, if you had a laugh at anything I've said already, there are no other jokes in this paper. David Livingstone was not famous for his humour. This rather serious Scotsman would produce a joke book of limited size, shall we say. Now, I'm going to talk, what I will do today is outline a biography of Livingstone for the first 10 or 15 minutes. Then I'll pass you over to Mike, who will talk about putting this show on the road. And then I will talk after Mike, I will talk about the Livingstone material that's held in the archives here. Livingstone was born in Blantyre in a mill town just south of Glasgow, and this is the tenement he was born in. He worked in the mill as a child. It's now the David Livingstone Centre at Blantyre. It's a museum which is open to the public. He worked in the mill as a child, but even as a child, he was a voracious reader. He taught himself sort of Latin and Greek, and he was a very keen natural observer, a natural history observer. Under his own steam, he studied the basic medical sciences in Glasgow from 1836 to 1838. And even here, he began to do something that he was to do throughout his life, which was to build up connections. He met a man called James Young, who was assistant to the professor of chemistry, and Young devised a method for producing what was christened paraffin, and this man became known as James Paraffin Young in his later life. Wealthy religious man who helped Livingstone out, financed in times of difficulty. He also met a fellow student, Lyon Playfair, who became Baron Playfair, both a chemist and a famous government advisor, and various other figures. So throughout his life, this is not a picture of a lonely missionary. This is a man who is heavily connected to political and aristocratic and scientific figures in Britain, notably in London. Anyway, he comes to London in 1839. He studies to be a missionary. In 1840, he goes back to Glasgow and gets the license of the Glasgow College of Physicians. And in that year, 1840, he goes off to Cape Town, actually as a missionary and a doctor, which became quite common by the end of the century. Livingstone was actually the first. Combining a missionary and medical career was rather unusual in the 1840s. From 1841, when he arrives in Africa, until his death in 1873, Livingstone's life falls rather nicely into three parts, which are divided by the years he spent back in Britain. So the first part goes up to about 1856, and he's 2 years in London. He then returns to 2 years in Britain, but mainly in London. He returns to Africa for the second period, 1858 to 64, and then he returns to Britain again, and in 1865 he returns to Africa, where he dies, but is brought back for a funeral at Westminster Abbey. We can leave that up, I can go, let's leave him up there for the moment. In his first years of the first period, in the 1840s, Livingstone is a very traditional missionary. He stays in a village, he starts preaching, builds a church, digs his garden, gets married, has children, and it's a model life that he's living, and I think that is what's going on. It's the model that is meant to be disseminated to the local peoples. But by the 1849, 1850, the wanderlust starts to set in. He's not really happy. He's only made one convert in 10 years. He travels up to the north of the Kalahari Desert. He then treks across to Portuguese Angola in the west, and then walks all the way back to the mouth of the Zambezi in the east. And he's probably the first European to have crossed the whole of Africa. And by this time, he's built up quite a lot of connections. He's writing to Sir Roderick Murchison, Fellow of the Royal Society, big wheel in the Royal Geographical Society. He's writing to Richard Owen, who's the greatest comparative anatomist in Europe, sending him specimens. So even before he returns in 1856, Livingstone has built up a reception committee. He comes back, and the people in Britain know about this trans-African trek, so he comes back to enormous public acclaim. This is his peak moment, I think, 1856. 1857, he publishes Missionary Travels, which is a huge bestseller. So by 1858, he's become a celebrity, great Victorian celebrity. It's in these years that he gets nominated to become a Fellow of the Royal Society. You probably can't see this very well, but this is his nomination certificate, and all the great names are there: Roderick Murchison, Charles Babbage, Daubeny, and so forth. In these years, back in Britain, 1856 to 58, he initiates the second period of his life, 58 to 64. He's very taken at the end of his trans-African trek with the area around the Zambezi, which he thinks is going to be ideal for colonisation by the British, even though the Portuguese have claims to it, and we could talk about that later if you wanted. And he makes a fatal mistake at this point, as it turns out, because in his trek along the Zambezi, he diverts south and returns north, and he misses out the Cabrassa Rapids, which are not navigable. And he comes back with the impression that the whole of the interior of Africa can be explored up the Zambezi, having not seen the Cabrassa Rapids. Anyway, during these 2 years, he generates support for a mission to Africa. He involves the Royal Society, the government, the landed gentry, to go to Africa. And he has a vision of Afro-Asian communities based on cotton, setting up in East Africa, in what is now Malawi, in the area around what is now Lake Malawi, was then Lake Nyasa, a lake which it's very disputed. He says he discovered, but it looks very like a Portuguese explorer had been there before him. But he generates a great deal of support for the Zambezi expedition. He leaves the London Missionary Society, not because he ceases to be devout, but his aims and theirs, what he sees as missionizing, what theirs are, no longer coincide. His vision is to bring commerce and commerce and industry by exporting the British poor. He always talks about English. He never talks about British, funny enough, or Scots. Bringing English poor labourers, craftsmen, and housewives to set up monastic. He talks about, I want the monastery system without celibacy. And that's not one of his jokes. He means it. And he has this vision of these Afro-European societies based on cotton in the East African area around the north of the lower Zambezi, where there is an area called Shire, or Shire as it looks on the page. The Shire Highlands, the Shire Highlands and the Shire River he sees as ideal for setting up these model Christian industrial societies. It's an image, of course, which harks back to his childhood, and if you think about it, just down the road where he was born was Robert Owen's model village of New Lanark. But of course, Livingstone never mentions Robert Owen because he's not going to talk about an atheist. Anyhow, the steamer for this expedition is financed by the government, but it's a petition from Edward Sabine, who's a bigwheel in the Royal Society, a geophysicist, who I'll talk about later, who generates the money for the purchase of this steamer, which I'll also come back to. Just give you a sense of Livingstone's boundless optimism for Africa. He writes to Murchison, just as he's returning in 1856, that Africa, he says, is capable by the fertility of the soil, abundance of water and labour, of yielding an unlimited supply of agricultural produce, cotton, coffee, sugar, indigo, oil, fibrous tissues, woods, etc. These are going to be the communities based on immigrant English poor. This is a letter he writes to Lord Kinnaird in 1861 when he's gone back on the Zambezi expedition. He's still full of optimism. Kinnaird's an aristocrat, agricultural improver, interested in philanthropic enterprises which will assist labourers. And he writes to Kinnaird, and this is from the site, that the kind of people, this is right at the top, I'm sorry if you can't see this, but the middle of the letter, he writes, the kind of people that would suit this country would be families of the agricultural class, men that could tend their hands to anything, build their own huts, make their own doors, tables, chairs, everything. I haven't got time to discuss it now, and you may want to ask me later, because it's not quite clear how he sees the relations between indigenous Africans and colonising British Europeans actually working. And Livingstone on these questions is actually tremendously interesting. In fact, in many ways, the Zambezi expedition and the Shire Highlands colonisation turn out to be complete disasters, not least because Livingstone was a hopeless leader, because the slave trade cuts right through the area that he wants to colonise. The Zambezi is not navigable. He has very bad relations with the people he works with, and I'll come back to that in the second part. It does produce scientific results. John Kirk, the economic botanist on the expedition, sends back lots of specimens to Kew, which become the basis of what is even today an ongoing publication, the Flora of Tropical Africa. Some of the geomagnetic observations get incorporated into later publications. He returns to London after the Zambezi expedition in 1864, not quite to the same reception that he got in 1856. He's not exactly shunned, but he's not quite the figure that he was after his first return. During this period, he gets driven with twin projects it's very hard to disentangle. One is the discovery of the source of the Nile, which is much disputed. And there's a personal element in here because both Robert Burton and John Speke had claimed to have found the source of the Nile or speculate on the source of the Nile. And Burton and Speke had a big disagreement over this earlier. And Livingstone despised both of these men, basically, and I think he's partly driven by that, and he's also driven by his hatred of the slave trade. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What he'd seen in the Shire Highlands, the brutalities of Portuguese, Arab slave traders and the tribal Africans, the internecine warfare that's going on is desperate, and I think he's driven by two things. So this last period, 68 to 73 to his death, 65 to his death in 73, we don't catch much sight of him. He's searching for the source of the Nile, which he thinks is Lake Tanganyika, which it's not, it's actually Lake Victoria, and he goes to his grave, which actually Speke had suggested many years earlier. This period is famous perhaps for one thing, when in 1869, Gordon Bennett Jr. of the New York Herald tells Henry Morton Stanley to go and find Livingstone. Now, of course, Livingstone wasn't lost at all, just that nobody else knew where he was. He knew perfectly well where he was. Stanley finds Livingstone, and as we know, this is the Mar Robert. This is Thomas Baines was a wonderful artist on the Zambezi expedition. This is from the Royal Geographical Society. This is the Mar Robert, the steamer, which I'll come back to in part 2. And this is the Zambezi, again by Thomas Baines. This is the famous meeting in which Stanley reportedly said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And Tim Geel, Stanley's latest biographer, who's had access to the Stanley archives in Brussels, pretty well suggests that Stanley, the confabulist, the journalist, actually made this up later. And Geel seems very convincing on this, and I urge you to read what is a lovely biography. Livingstone, as you might have now imagined from this man who's making all these connections, is a prolific writer. He writes 2,000 letters, which are in archives throughout the world, though a great number are in the National Library of Scotland. We've published some from the National Library, the Livingstone Centre at Blantyre, from Glasgow, Royal Geographical Society, and now the Royal Society. We're trying to publish those with a medical and scientific content at the moment. This project is made possible by the existence of a catalogue, a printed catalogue of Livingstone's, of the whereabouts of most of Livingstone's letters, and without that, we wouldn't be able to do what we are now doing. I'll turn you over to Mike, because Mike, who's our, as I say, our technical wizard, and has just been supervising the publication of that catalogue online, as well as all this other material. And Mike will talk to you a little bit about this side of the project.
Thanks. And as Chris has mentioned several times through here, we're an online project. And creating an online resource can be a daunting task, and it requires addressing a wide range of technological issues, as well as critically reconsidering fundamental issues concerning our role as a content provider, the nature of our audience, as well as the uses of our materials. And these issues are not, in themselves, unique to the online world. They've been an inherent part of any editorial activity or publishing endeavor. However, they merit special consideration when creating an online resource that can be freely used by anyone with an internet connection, because an open access scholarly resource has the capacity to attract a far more diverse audience than most academics are accustomed to. It consequently becomes much harder to assume that you know best how and by whom your materials will be used. And in the time I've been allotted, I thought I would explore some of the issues associated with creating an online resource that is capable of appealing to both academics and interested lay readers. Along the way, I thought I would also be highlighting some of the key features on our project that I believe facilitate this synthesis of audiences. The core principles underlying our work could be called audience-informed design, and it's predicated on providing the progressive enhancement of a resource that has the capacity to appeal to the differing needs and expectations of our audience. And this requires creating tools that enable with our visitors to engage with our texts in a more meaningful manner. And I'm just going to show you some of the offerings that demonstrate these tools at this point. And since our work is based on the progressive enhancement of materials, we don't have to wait until the entire extant corpus of Livingstone's letters have been published or have been edited in order to begin publication. And that means that we can put materials up as soon as they've been transcribed and edited by one of the senior editors, and this gives our audience the capacity to view our materials much sooner than they would have been able to if we had done a print edition. And we are constantly publishing new materials. And although we only officially commenced in January of this year, Livingstone Online already has 109 texts online, including 7 of those contained within the Royal Society, and we have another 100 in preparation for release. And among the more interesting technologically of the materials we have on offer is this letter to Richard Owen, the Hunterian professor at the Royal College of Surgeons, and another set of prescriptions by Livingstone are also quite interesting. And the final representations of the text, as you can see here, is dynamically generated from extensible markup language, or XML, transcriptions. And these transcriptions semantically encode and describe all the significant editorial features of the original documents, such as additions and deletions, illegible text, shorthand abbreviations, along with their expanded forms, as well as editorial corrections and interventions. And this differs from the older print practice, where these editorial features would be represented solely through the use of various types of character styling or the insertion of cryptic and often quite idiosyncratic symbols or delimiters around the text. Or another possible way this information would have been shown is, again, having been relegated to an editorial apparatus contained in footnotes or endnotes. And rather than indicating that a portion of text has simply been deleted by formatting it as struck through, we would instead code it in the following manner. And as you can see here, this is just the sample here, I thought it'd be useful. You have the tag here describing that it is a deletion. You have the tag describing what type of deletion it is. In this case, it's just struck through with a single line. And you can also see that we're also able to attribute editorial responsibility to the person who was responsible for making this decision in transcription. And in this case, it was Carolyn who did this. Below it, you can also see how an abbreviation could be dealt with. And you have at this portion here, Gulli, or the Latin for William, and you have contained within this here the expanded version of William. And these texts are then transformed into the versions that you see on screen via Extensible Style Sheet Language Transformations Code, or XSLT code. And this code determines how to process and represent each type of editorial or textual artifact in the document. And the advantage of these transformations is that you have the capacity to generate multiple versions of the same document based on the same XML transcription. And in the letter for Owen, for example, this is the default representation of our texts here. And this is what is known as a diplomatic view. And this privileges the authorial process by offering a detailed representation of the document with minimal editorial intervention. Deletions and abbreviations are shown, or deletions and additions are shown, abbreviations are left unexpanded, and most editorial interventions are not applied. And by this time next year, we're going to be offering an additional view, which we would call the normalized view. And this provides a cleaner and more readable form of the text. Deletions would not be shown at all. Additions would be silently included within the text, and all abbreviations would be expanded and editorial interventions applied. And you can see a sample of how this might look when you look at this prescription for William Mason here. And as you can see here, while the Latin and the arcane symbols that were used in 19th century pharmacology might be visually compelling, it also renders this document incomprehensible to all but the most learned and specialized of audiences. And so to this end, we have a different representation. And this text that you see here, which provides a translation and expansion of all those cryptic symbols, was dynamically generated from the same source file. The original file contains both the original version plus this more accessible one here. And okay, just checking on the time there, and it appears that I'm running a bit late, so I'll skip one section here. And there's another feature that we offer that I believe allows users to be able to engage with our materials in a more meaningful fashion. And this is the presence of detailed content markup. And we're endeavoring to actually research and describe every identifiable name, place, or significant concept that occurs within Livingstone's writings. And this would be the material that normally would be relegated to a scholarly apparatus or footnotes, but instead here, it is embedded within the document. So you can see here a brief biography of Richard Owen. And all the items here that are double underlined would have the same sort of markup. And if we go back to the prescription, you can see another advantage for this sort of thing here, where again, we've got the cryptic Latin, the arcane symbols. And if you do a mouse over, you get a description of what that symbol means. In this case, that is the symbol for semis, or half, and this symbol here is a dram. So what you have embodied within the text are two distinct uses. On the one hand, you have these XMLs embodying a historical document that is available in both an English and Latin form. But you also have an interactive instructional aid. So it's merging the idea of historical resource and teaching aid to help people not only learn about Livingstone or read his materials, but also be able to improve their knowledge so they can deal with similar materials without so much work on our part. And as time's running out, I'll just briefly touch upon something that Chris has mentioned, and this is the detailed catalog of Livingstone's manuscripts. We've just released that earlier this week, and it's based on the excellent work by Gary Clendenin and Ian Cunningham that was conducted over 20 years ago. And we've been developing this catalog for the first 6 months of the year, and we were able to use their excellent work as the foundation for our work. But already we've gone beyond their work. We've already managed to find numerous items which had not been indexed by them, including the materials contained here in the Royal Society. And this catalog in itself also provides another example of the usefulness of progressive enhancement. This catalog has actually been online and at the core of our functioning for the past 3 months. It just would not have been visible to anyone. It replaced a much older and provisional database of transcripts, and this became basically the backbone for much of the functioning of our work. And the catalog itself is still being actively developed. In addition to adding any new manuscripts that happen to be found, we're also updating a lot of the data contained within it. The custodial information itself actually is in need of many updates, since it doesn't take into account some of the vagaries and changes in African geopolitical structures since the time it was created. And once we finish this catalog will actually be the most comprehensive catalog of Livingstone's papers in existence. And in conclusion, I hope you found this very brief, somewhat whirlwind tour of our offerings interesting. And I'd like to conclude by saying that there is one other advantage to the notion of progressive enhancement. And this is that we are able to adjust and alter our work based on the comments and feedback that we receive from the people that use it. So I encourage everyone who uses this site to please contact us. Let us know if you think something can be better. Let us know if you've got an idea for something that we haven't done. And if we can do it, we'll do our best to do it. Our goal is to try and provide the best resource that we can. So please email us at livingstononline@ucl.ac.uk with all your suggestions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And of course, if you should find the very uncommon mistake, we'd like to know about those too. I'm going to talk now about the Livingstone material here at the Royal Society, which, as Mike pointed out, astonishingly wasn't discovered by Gary Clendenin and Ian Cunningham, who produced this magnificent catalogue of over 2,000 letters held all over the world. Livingstone built up extensive connections with Royal Society figures, Murchison and Owen I've already mentioned. Most of his connections, and indeed all of his connections with the Royal Society itself, concerned the Zambezi expedition of 1858-64. In 1857, a year before the expedition set off, a Zambezi committee was formed here, and Lord Shelburne at the Foreign Office wrote to the Secretary of the Society to ask of that committee, and this is the copy. This is actually Shelburne's letter to the Secretary of the Royal Society, saying that what advantage can be taken of Dr. Livingstone's proposed expedition to Africa, and in the second page he asks about what suggestions the Society might make in respect of the scientific portion of the labours of the expedition. You probably can't read that from where you are, but that, I promise you, that is what this letter says. And the response to Shelburne is written by William Sharpie, the physiologist at University College London, who is the Secretary of the Royal Society. And he replies that this is the first page. It's actually a draft of Sharpie's response. And on the second page, he lists the positions and people that the Society thinks should be on board, literally at first, and then metaphorically later, the expedition. And at the top is a list, and again, you probably can't read it. It starts off with a naval officer, who is a man called Bedingfield. This is a story of tragedy, who Livingstone falls out with and gives the sack. It's followed by an economic botanist, who is Sir John Kirk, who is probably one of the great botanists of the 19th century, who became, interestingly, a diplomat, and he was one of the few people that managed to get on with Livingstone during the Zambezi years. A mining geologist, who was a man called Richard Thornton, who Livingstone fell out with and gave the sack. A draftsman and storekeeper, who was Thomas Baines, whose pictures you saw earlier, who Livingstone falls out with and gives the sack. An engineer, who is a man called George Ray, who goes off and becomes a slave trader, or at least employs slaves on a plantation. And Charles Livingstone. If Livingstone had faults, he was a bad leader. Kirk talks about him being a crackpot, but he never says anything about his moral character. Livingstone is always perceived by Kirk as deeply upright. But Charles Livingstone, David's brother, who is there through nepotism, Kirk has very, very bad words to say about. Anyhow, the Society instructed various of its members to write dossiers for specific members of the expedition. Here's one written by Richard Owen, which is for the zoologist. There wasn't actually a zoologist on the expedition in the end, but to explore the natural history of the Zambezi area, and particularly, I'm sorry you can't see this, but right at the top, it says, I'd like him to look out for the natural history of the tsetse fly, because it was well known that the tsetse fly killed in some way was associated with the death of domestic animals. Nobody had put it together at that point that there was a relationship between that tsetse fly and sleeping sickness. But it was well known that the tsetse fly killed domestic animals, and this is Owen's instructions for that. Livingstone's letters in the Society are addressed to John Herschel, the great astronomer. Oh, and sorry, this is Edward Sabin, the geophysicist interested in terrestrial magnetism. This is Sabin who became president of the Society eventually. And Sabin instructs the members of the Zambezi exhibition in how to take magnetical observations. And in particular, he instructs the wayward Charles Livingstone at Kew Observatory how to do this. And these seem to be, like Owen's instructions, these seem to be Sabin's instructions on, and at the top underlined, on taking magnetic observations, sometimes magnetical, he writes, signed Edward Sabin. And as I say, these magnetical observations got published in 1877 in Sabin's Contributions to Terrestrial Magnetism in the Philtrans of the Society. Livingstone wrote at least one letter to the great astronomer John Herschel, which he wrote just as he was leaving on the Zambezi expedition. And he says, this is our transcription, that I'm very sorry, I've never met you. They obviously knew a great deal about each other. And Livingstone refers here to how Herschel had written via Murchison when Livingstone was in Africa. Livingstone's just on his way home, I'm very sorry. No, he's just leaving for the Zambezi, it's 58. But Livingstone reminds Herschel that he'd heard of him when he was in Africa, and Herschel had asked Livingstone just before his return to inquire into something very odd, to inquire into the gradual desiccation of the country. The archives contain 5 letters, well, 5 autographed letters of Livingstone, 1 to Herschel and 4 to Sabin, and 2 extracts of letters, which are copy letters from Livingstone to Sabin. The first one, the earliest letter to the Society, is an extract of a letter. This is probably to Lord Malmesbury, but it's in the Society archives, and somebody's copied it, stating, and this is from Kongoni Harbour at the mouth of the Zambezi, saying that Charles Livingstone is making magnetical observations. The first letter to Sabin in Livingstone's hand, we now have up online, was sent when Sabin was treasurer in 1858, I think it's at Tete. He's just arrived. Tete is a town near the mouth of the Zambezi. And he says, I'm now sending you the first instalment of our observations. Slightly later, he then writes again and says he's having a bad time. I've sent the first instalment of observations, but Baines, the painter, has had sunstroke. A portion of the roof of our house was blown away. The instruments don't work technically, and it's all not going very well, sir, reporting to the headmaster, really. This is a letter from Charles Livingstone, probably enclosed with that letter from David to Edward Sabin. And here are some observations from Expedition Island. If it wasn't so tragic, the Zambezi expedition would be like a Whitehall farce. Boats are always sinking, crocodiles are always eating people, the food is always disappearing overboard, and storms blow away roofs, and it goes on like this, and it is actually tragic, but has that, if it wasn't about human life in that way, it would almost be farce. He then writes to Sabin when things are getting worse. The Mar Robert, who's the steamer I told you about, I can do this in a couple of minutes so we have time for questions. He writes, in spite of the interest employed on behalf of the Royal Society, Mr. Laird, who's the shipbuilder in Birkenhead, furnished us with a most wretched vessel. I'm sorry to inform you that our magnetic instruments have lately suffered severely in consequence. And the Mar Robert, they christen her the asthmatic. She uses tons and tons of wood. They spend half the day chopping wood to go a mile up the Zambezi. it leaks, it rots and sinks eventually within a year. That is a glamorous vision of the Mar Robert, unlike the one drawn by Baines that I showed you earlier. In 1861, things are looking a bit better. Dear General Sabin, he writes from Kongoni at the mouth of the Zambezi, I'm expecting a new vessel, the Lady Nyassa, which is being built on the Clyde. They exported these things in pieces and built them at the mouth of the Zambezi. And he also welcomes the news, and again, this is a terrible story, of Oxford and Cambridge forming a mission to go to the Shire Highlands under Bishop Mackenzie. And Livingstone hopes that the missionaries might make magnetical observations. The well-educated young men, he says in this letter, who will follow the bishop would no doubt cheerfully undertake any work tending to advance the interest of either science or civilization. In fact, it was a disaster. Bishop Mackenzie dies of fever in the Shire Highlands, and the mission is abandoned and taken to Zanzibar. The final letter from Livingstone, Mike didn't, I think, mention the fact that on our site, you can see side by side, if you wish, the original letters and the transcriptions. Or you can see the transcriptions, or you can see the original letters. This is a letter from Sabin, his last letter to Sabin, as far as we know. In Bombay in 1865, he comes back on the Lady Nyassa in an extraordinary feat of seamanship, because Livingstone was not a sailor, but he navigates the Lady Nyassa from the Zambezi to Bombay on his way home, leaves her there, returns to Bombay because he can't sell her as he returns to discover the source of the Nile, as he hopes. And again, he writes this slightly apologetic letter. He's come back to the Lady Nyassa in Bombay, and he writes, Dear Sir Edward, my dear General Sabin, as he is at that point, by some unaccountable mistake, some of the magnetic instruments had been taken on board the Lady Nyassa, and on clearing out, I found them. So there's the Royal Society's instruments have been left in Bombay for a year, and that's the transcription. I'll cut this last little bit out because you may want to ask some questions. He never comes back after his final expedition, and there is no more correspondence in the Royal Society. Murchison remains his great patron in these last years. I also wonder whether the Society doesn't maybe distance itself a little from Livingstone. The Zambezi expedition has not been a great success, shall we say. There may be more material to come, more to find out, and I hope you'll keep up with the ongoing story by tuning into Livingstone online. Thank you very much. Oh, finally, I need to thank a few people for the images. The Wellcome Library London, the Royal Society itself, the Royal Geographical Society for the Baines pictures, and ourselves.